Imagine a small, quiet town where nothing ever seems out of place. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the biggest scandal is usually a neighborhood dog gone missing. Now, imagine that same town being ripped apart by a horror so unspeakable that it shatters the very fabric of its calm existence. Years ago, a brutal murder shook this tranquil community to its core. Harold Weems, a seemingly ordinary wildlife photographer with a reputation for kindness, was accused of committing an atrocity so gruesome that it made headlines across the country. A family, once the picture of suburban bliss, was found slaughtered in their own home. The details were more horrific than any nightmare: a mother's skin torn to shreds, a young boy skinned and hung from an old laundry chute. The case was supposed to be closed, but the horror didn't end with the trial. For me, the terror was only beginning. As a child, the nightmare of those murders clung to my dreams, festering into an obsession. Years later, as a film student desperate for a breakthrough, I saw an opportunity to uncover the truth behind the chilling case. I sought out Harold Weems, expecting a frail, broken man. Instead, I encountered something far more sinister. What I discovered within the decaying walls of his home defied explanation and sanity. It wasn't just Weems hiding from the world, it was something far more malevolent, something that manipulated him and, by extension, me. The more I learned, the more I realized I was caught in a web of dark secrets and forbidden knowledge. Now, as I look back, I can't escape the feeling that I've become part of something far greater and darker than I ever imagined. Beazle, the entity that lurks in the shadows of that cursed house, has a way of pulling you into its grasp, making you a part of its endless nightmare. So, if you dare to listen to my story, be prepared. Because once you hear it, the dark presence of Beazle might just find its way to you, as well. The horror is far from over, and now, you too might find yourself trapped in the unending darkness. Before we start our story, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. It is very important for us to be able to bring you more content like this. When the chilling news broke, my entire town was thrown into a state of utter shock and disbelief. It's not every day that a seemingly gentle, family man becomes the focus of such a horrifying crime. My name is Alex, and I was just a middle schooler when Harold Weems's name became synonymous with terror. Harold Weems was the kind of man you'd expect to find in a cozy wildlife photography studio, his gentle demeanor and warm smile making him a beloved figure in our community. He was always out in the fields, capturing the beauty of nature with his camera, and everyone knew him as a soft-spoken, dedicated family man. So when the news broke that he had slaughtered his entire family, it was like the ground had shifted beneath our feet. The details that emerged were nothing short of nightmarish. His wife was discovered sprawled on the basement floor, her skin grotesquely torn and mutilated, as if some beast had clawed at her. The horror didn't stop there. His young son, who was the same age as me at the time, was found skinned and hanging from an old, rusty laundry chute, a macabre display that sent chills down my spine and left an indelible mark on my young mind. As a child, these stories seeped into my dreams, twisting them into dark and horrifying scenarios. I found myself growing increasingly wary of my own father, my mind filled with irrational fears that made me cling to my mother with a desperation I couldn't fully explain. It wasn't just me, either. Kids in my class would dare each other to approach the Weems house, their voices trembling as they counted out loud to see who could endure the longest near the site of the atrocity. I never participated in those dare games, but the fear they instilled only grew stronger in me. The case turned our quiet community into a media circus, with every detail of the murders broadcasted for the world to see. It was a spectacle of horror, and while the town eventually moved on, the grotesque images never left me. Harold Weems's trial was a circus of its own. His defense claimed he was under the influence of a woman living within the walls of his house, a strange and unsettling excuse that did little to quell the fears of those who had known him. Years later, as a college student, I found myself immersed in the world of film studies. My GPA was a dismal 2.9, and I desperately needed a compelling topic for my thesis documentary to salvage my academic standing. That's when the dark and twisted idea of revisiting the Weems case took hold of me. The thought of exploring the mystery behind his horrific crime and presenting it to the world was both thrilling and terrifying. To my astonishment, Harold Weems agreed to an interview. His only stipulation was that I come alone. My initial reaction was a mix of excitement and dread. Weems was now in his 70s, and I rationalized that he could hardly be a threat. Still, an unsettling feeling gnawed at me, but the lure of a groundbreaking documentary was too strong to ignore. The following week, I trudged through the rain-soaked streets, carrying my heavy JVC camcorder like a talisman against the growing sense of foreboding. The journey to Weems's house was a 2-mile trek from the nearest bus stop, and with every step, the feeling of dread intensified. As I approached the dilapidated house, its crumbling facade and overgrown yard seemed to whisper dark secrets from the past. When I finally stood at the doorstep, I was struck by a shocking revelation. The man who answered the door was not the frail, elderly figure I had imagined. Instead, I was greeted by a man who seemed unnervingly youthful, with piercing green eyes that locked onto mine with an unsettling intensity. He had a spring in his step and an eerie, knowing smile that sent a shiver down my spine. When Harold Weems invited me into his home, a chill ran down my spine. I had expected an elderly man, perhaps frail and shuffling, but the figure that greeted me was anything but. His youthful energy seemed at odds with the grisly reputation he'd earned. He wore an oddly cheerful expression, as though he were about to share a grand secret. "Welcome, Alex," he said, his voice unexpectedly warm. "I've been looking forward to this. Please, come in." As I stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The house was a stark contrast to the vibrant exterior. It was dank and musty, filled with the acrid stench of rot and decay. My nose wrinkled at the unpleasant odor, but politeness kept me moving forward. Every instinct in my body screamed to turn around and leave, but the need to complete my documentary kept me rooted to the spot. The interior of the house was a collage of old, dusty furniture and faded photographs. The walls were lined with framed wildlife prints, images of serene forests and majestic animals that seemed out of place in the setting of such horror. My footsteps echoed unnervingly in the stillness, each sound amplifying my growing sense of unease. Weems led me to a dimly lit room at the back of the house, which seemed to serve as his workspace. The air here was colder, and the flickering light from a single bulb cast eerie shadows on the walls. He directed me to set up the camera in a corner of the room while he prepared his notes. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of my discomfort, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the oppressive atmosphere made me feel like I was being scrutinized by unseen eyes. Once everything was ready, Weems settled into a worn-out armchair and gestured for me to sit across from him. His demeanor was unsettlingly calm, his eyes glinting with an unsettling mixture of excitement and something darker, an almost predatory gleam that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "So, Alex," he began, leaning forward with a conspiratorial whisper. "What do you really want to know?" I hesitated for a moment, trying to steady my voice. "I want to understand what happened that night. The details of the case, what really led to the deaths of your family." Weems's smile widened, but it was devoid of warmth. "Ah, the details. They're not as simple as they seem. But I can tell you this, there's a truth that has remained hidden, and it's time someone finally knew." As he spoke, the room seemed to grow colder, and the shadows on the walls danced in unsettling patterns. The conversation took a strange turn as Weems began to describe things that were beyond the realm of ordinary explanation. He spoke of a sinister entity, an otherworldly presence he called Beazle, that had been living within the walls of his house, manipulating and controlling everything. His words were cryptic and filled with a sense of dread that made my skin crawl. I tried to focus on his explanations, but the more he spoke, the more my anxiety grew. I could feel a palpable sense of malevolence in the air, and every instinct told me to get out of there as quickly as possible. Yet, the fascination with his revelations kept me in place, my camera rolling as I documented his unsettling account. The interview seemed to stretch on endlessly, with Weems's descriptions becoming more bizarre and chilling by the minute. It was as though he was drawing me into a dark web of his own making, one that I struggled to comprehend but couldn't escape. The longer I stayed in Weems's house, the more I felt the weight of something unnatural pressing down on me. The room seemed to pulse with an almost imperceptible energy, and the shadows on the walls grew darker and more distorted as the interview progressed. Every word Weems spoke seemed to dig deeper into a darkness I wasn't prepared to confront. As he continued, his narrative grew increasingly unsettling. He spoke of Beazle as though she were an ancient entity, an eldritch force that had been living within the walls for decades, feeding off fear and manipulating the lives of those unfortunate enough to cross her path. According to Weems, Beazle was the true architect of the murders, her influence compelling him to commit the unthinkable acts. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," Weems insisted, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and something that resembled reverence. "But Beazle? She has a way of making you do things, of bending your will until you have no choice but to obey. She whispered to me, drove me mad with her demands." I was torn between skepticism and the gnawing sense that there was some truth to his claims. The house itself seemed to resonate with his words, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on me, as if they held secrets and malign forces just out of sight. "Do you see it?" Weems asked suddenly, his eyes gleaming with a manic light. "Do you feel her presence? She's always watching, always waiting." My heart raced as I glanced around the room, trying to see what he was pointing at. The shadows danced more erratically now, and the cold in the room seemed to seep into my bones. The camera's light flickered intermittently, casting eerie shapes that seemed to come alive with every blink. Suddenly, Weems stood up and walked over to a dusty, old cupboard. He pulled out a vintage projector and a reel labeled, "For Your Eyes Only." His hands shook slightly as he set up the equipment. "This," he said, "is how she communicates. It's how she reveals herself to those who are willing to see." With a shiver of apprehension, I watched as Weems started the projector. The room was filled with the whirring sound of the old machine, and the screen lit up with grainy, unsettling footage. The images were of shadowy figures in dark robes performing strange rituals in what looked like clandestine settings. The footage also included clips of secret government meetings, with figures who seemed to be working in the shadows, their faces obscured. I was transfixed and horrified, unable to look away from the screen but desperate to understand what I was seeing. Weems narrated the footage with an intensity that bordered on fanaticism, explaining that Beazle was connected to these hidden, sinister networks. The more I watched, the more I felt like I was being pulled into a web of dark forces beyond my comprehension. As the reel came to an end, Weems's demeanor shifted. He became more erratic, his eyes wild and desperate. "You have to understand," he pleaded, "she's everywhere. Even now, she's trying to reach you." A sense of dread settled over me as I realized the full extent of the horror I had walked into. The oppressive atmosphere of the house, combined with Weems's increasingly disturbing revelations, was starting to take its toll on me. I could feel an unnameable force trying to push its way into my mind, and I knew I had to leave. "Thank you for sharing this with me," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady as I packed up my equipment. "I think I've got enough for the documentary." Weems's smile was unsettlingly serene as he escorted me to the door. "Remember, Alex," he said softly, "Beazle is always watching. She knows who sees her and who tries to turn away." A wave of relief washed over me as I finally left Harold Weems's house, but it was short-lived. The sense of dread clung to me like a thick, suffocating fog. I could hardly focus on the road as I drove away, the dim streetlights casting eerie shadows that seemed to flicker in time with my racing heartbeat. Every bump in the road felt like a jolt of fear, and I found myself glancing nervously into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, following me. The drive home felt like it lasted an eternity. My thoughts were a jumbled mess of confusion and terror, haunted by the images I had witnessed. The footage on the projector was still burned into my mind, the shadowy figures performing those grotesque rituals, the flickering images of secret meetings in hidden locations. My rational mind struggled to reconcile what I had seen with reality. When I finally arrived at my apartment, the familiar surroundings did little to comfort me. I locked the door behind me and sank into the couch, staring blankly at the blank TV screen. The darkness in the room seemed to press in on me, a tangible presence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I tried to convince myself that it was just stress and exhaustion, but deep down, I knew something more sinister was at work. Over the next few days, I threw myself into editing the documentary. Each frame felt like a glimpse into a world I didn't fully understand, and the footage seemed to take on a life of its own. The shadows in the video seemed to writhe and shift, as if they were trying to communicate something beyond the realm of human comprehension. I felt an eerie sense of unease every time I reviewed the material, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to separate the nightmares from reality. It wasn't long before the nightmares started. They were vivid and relentless, a cascade of terrifying images that left me gasping for breath. In my dreams, I found myself wandering through dark, oppressive hallways, chased by faceless figures that whispered my name in voices that sent shivers down my spine. The name Beazle echoed through the darkness, a haunting mantra that seemed to grow louder and more insistent with each passing night. The line between nightmare and reality began to blur. During the day, I would catch myself glancing over my shoulder, convinced that I was being watched. I began to avoid certain streets and areas of town, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was pulling me back toward that house. One evening, as I was heading home from the university, a strange compulsion took hold of me. I had no conscious intention of going near Weems's house, but as I drove, my mind seemed to operate on autopilot. Before I knew it, I was parked in front of the old, decrepit house, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and confusion. The house loomed before me, its dark, decaying facade appearing even more sinister under the pale glow of the streetlights. The air around the house was heavy, saturated with a palpable sense of malevolence. It felt as though the darkness itself was alive, wrapping around me like an oppressive shroud. I sat in my car, staring at the house, my breath coming in short, anxious gasps. The memories of the interview, the footage, and the nightmarish dreams all converged into a single, overwhelming dread. Against my better judgment, I found myself drawn toward the front door. My footsteps felt sluggish and hesitant, each one echoing loudly in the stillness of the night. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorbell. The house seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, and I could almost feel the weight of unseen eyes watching me from within. Just as I was about to turn away, I saw a figure step out from the shadows of the porch. It was Weems, but he appeared different, almost otherworldly. His eyes gleamed with a malevolent light, and his youthful appearance was now accompanied by an unsettling aura of otherworldliness. He smiled, but it was a twisted, knowing smile that sent a chill down my spine. "You've come back," he said in a voice that was both soothing and sinister. "Beazle has noticed your presence. She's interested in you now." A wave of panic surged through me, and I turned to flee, but my legs felt like lead. The sense of dread was overwhelming, and I could feel the pull of the house, as though it were drawing me into its dark embrace. I stumbled away from the door and practically ran to my car, my mind reeling from the encounter. As I drove away, the fear that had settled into my bones remained. The thought of Beazle and her sinister influence seemed to follow me, a constant reminder of the darkness I had glimpsed. Despite my best efforts to move on, I found myself inexplicably drawn back to that house, unable to escape the pull of the malevolent force that seemed to reach out from the shadows. The more I learned about Beazle, the stronger her grip seemed to become. My once rational mind was now plagued by doubt and fear, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was closing in on me. The house, and the entity that resided within its walls, had become an inescapable part of my reality, and I knew that confronting the darkness was no longer a matter of choice, it was a matter of survival. The pull of the house grew stronger with each passing day. Despite my efforts to avoid it, I found myself inexplicably drawn back to the old, decaying structure. The fear that had once been a distant, unsettling presence had now become a constant companion, gnawing at my mind and heart. It started with small things. I would find myself driving past the house on my way to classes or work, even though I had no conscious intention of going there. My thoughts would wander, and before I knew it, I was parked outside, staring up at the darkened windows with a mix of dread and fascination. Each visit left me shaken, and yet I couldn't stay away. My nightmares continued to plague me, more vivid and disturbing than ever. In my dreams, I would wander through the labyrinthine hallways of the house, chased by the haunting whispers of Beazle. The wall seemed to close in around me, and I could feel her presence lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment to strike. One evening, as I was editing the footage for the documentary, I received an anonymous email. It was a single line of text: "She knows you're coming." There was no sender, no other information, just those chilling words. I stared at the screen, a cold shiver running down my spine. I had hoped that confronting the darkness might somehow bring me clarity, but now I wondered if I was being manipulated by forces beyond my understanding. My friends and family started to notice the changes in me. I was more withdrawn, my conversations punctuated by sudden bouts of paranoia. I avoided social gatherings and declined invitations, unable to shake the feeling that Beazle's influence was seeping into every aspect of my life. My once routine activities became tainted with fear, and the sense of impending doom loomed over me like a dark cloud. In an attempt to regain some semblance of control, I decided to visit the house one last time. I needed to confront Beazle directly, to understand the true nature of the entity that had taken over my life. I gathered my camera equipment, determined to capture whatever truths lay hidden within the walls. As I approached the house, the atmosphere was charged with a palpable sense of malevolence. The air was thick and oppressive, making it difficult to breathe. I hesitated at the front door, the same sense of dread that had plagued me on my previous visits now intensified. The thought of turning back was tempting, but curiosity and fear drove me forward. I pushed open the door, and the familiar stench of decay greeted me. The darkness inside seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and every creak of the floorboards echoed ominously through the empty rooms. I set up my camera and began to explore, trying to capture any signs of the entity that had haunted me for so long. As I ventured deeper into the house, I noticed subtle changes. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and the temperature dropped sharply. My breath came out in frosty puffs, and I could feel a cold, invisible hand brushing against my skin. The sense of being watched grew stronger, and I could almost hear Beazle's whispers in the corners of my mind. Finally, I reached the basement. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the abyss. I hesitated for a moment, the fear threatening to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to descend. The basement was even more sinister than I had imagined, a place of dark rituals and hidden horrors. In the dim light of my flashlight, I saw symbols scrawled on the walls and remnants of strange, occult objects scattered across the floor. The air was thick with the scent of something rotten, and the oppressive feeling of Beazle's presence was almost unbearable. I set up my camera, determined to capture evidence of the entity that had taken over my life. As I filmed, I began to feel a shift in the atmosphere. The temperature dropped even further, and I could sense Beasel's presence growing stronger. The whispers became more insistent, and I felt an icy chill creeping up my spine. The shadows seemed to gather around me, coalescing into a dark, menacing shape. It was then that I saw her. Beasel's form materialized from the darkness, a twisted and grotesque figure that defied all logic and reason. Her eyes gleamed with a malevolent light, and her smile was both horrifying and mesmerizing. I felt an overwhelming sense of terror and helplessness as she reached out toward me, her presence filling the room with an oppressive force. The camera recorded everything, but I could barely focus on it. My mind was overwhelmed by fear, and I felt myself being drawn into Beasel's grasp. I knew that I had to escape, but the fear was paralyzing. I stumbled back toward the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest as I struggled to break free from her grip. I made it out of the house, but the experience had left me profoundly shaken. The footage I captured was haunting, and the knowledge of what I had witnessed weighed heavily on me. Beasel's influence had become an inescapable part of my life, and the fear of her presence followed me wherever I went. Now, I find myself caught in a cycle of fear and fascination. The more I learn about Beasel, the stronger her pull becomes. I can't escape the feeling that she's always watching, always waiting for the moment when I'll be drawn back into her dark embrace. I've tried to move on, but the darkness lingers, a constant reminder of the horrors that lie within that old house. As I sit here, recounting the nightmare that has consumed my life, I can't help but feel a chilling sense of dread. The house, the figure of Harold Weems, and the sinister entity known as Beasel are no longer just stories, they are a haunting reality that has woven itself into my existence. I thought I was seeking truth and closure, but instead, I uncovered a darkness that now lingers in the shadows of my mind. Beasel's malevolent presence is relentless. Even now, I feel her gaze upon me, an ever-present reminder of the horrors that lurk just beyond the edge of comprehension. The lines between reality and nightmare have blurred, and I find myself ensnared in a terror that refuses to let go. You might think that this is where the story ends, but let me assure you, it is far from over. The more I delve into the darkness, the more I uncover, and the more I realize that the true horror may be far worse than anything I've shared. If you dare to seek further, if you want to know just how deep this abyss goes, I invite you to explore the other stories on my channel. Each tale is a chilling glimpse into the unknown, a journey into the heart of darkness that will test your nerves and your sanity. Subscribe, and join me as we continue to uncover the terrifying truths that lie in wait. Remember, curiosity can be a double-edged sword. The more you seek, the more you might find yourself drawn into a world where fear is the only constant. Are you brave enough to face the horrors that await? Or will you turn away, hoping the darkness will leave you untouched? The choice is yours, but remember this, once you step into the shadows, there is no guarantee of escape. The nightmare is only beginning.